Welcome to today's webinar, Cybervictimization Experiences of Sexual and Interpersonal Violence Survivors. My name is Susan Howley, and I'm the Program Director for the Center for Victim Research. The center is built through a partnership between researchers and practitioners at the Justice Research and Statistics Association, the National Center for Victims of Crime, and the Urban Institute. The center's mission is to serve as a one-stop resource for victim service providers and researchers to connect and share knowledge, to increase access to victim research and data and the utility of research and data to crime victim services nationwide. Today's webinar is designed to give access to new research on cybervictimization and provide tips to apply it in serving victims. The Center for Victim Research and this webinar are supported by funding for the Office for Victims of Crime at the Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice. And now it is my very great pleasure to welcome our presenters today, Dr. Shelly Clevenger and Kelsie Langheim-Frooman. I'm going to turn it over to them and let them introduce themselves. Dr. Clevenger, we'll start with you.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I am very excited to be here. I'm going to talk to you about my research today, and I thought I would start by talking about my research philosophy. So I'm somebody who's very passionate about conducting research that actually translates into something, and for me that is to improve the treatment of survivors and their families. And so I've been able to do this through presenting with local organizations, different rape crisis centers through the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I've also got to present my research at the United Nations Women, as well as at a congressional briefing that was organized by the DWC, which is part of the American Society of Criminology, and then also Zonta International. And I'm going to introduce my co-presenter today, Kelsey, and she's going to tell you a little bit about herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Kelsey. So just a little bit about myself is that I have both my undergraduate and graduate degree in criminal justice sciences from Illinois State University. This is where I first met Dr. Clevenger, and together we worked on her original research for about 3 years or so. So it was through this work with Dr. Clevenger that my interest sparked for working with victims of sexual assault. It's something that I'm really passionate about, and I've always wanted to be in a position where I'm able to help those who cannot help themselves. So this is exactly what I do as a Director of Client Services at Stepping Stones. I have the ability to ensure that victims of sexual assault in our county are provided the best services possible. I hope that this passion exudes onto the staff that I supervise. I hope that I can influence them to fight for victims' rights and kind of help them with their empathetic nature in counseling. So I'm going to pass it back to Shelly.
All right, everybody. So today what I'm going to be talking to you about is the research that I conducted, and this is looking at cyber-victimization, but it is really examining the link between in-person violent victimization and cyber-victimization. So my research is going to show you that there was a lot of connection between what happened in person, whether it was sexual assault or intimate partner violence, and also the cyber victimization. And so I'm also going to demonstrate for you what it means to be an action-oriented researcher and exactly how I partnered with the local rape crisis center, which is Stepping Stones. So my current research project that I have just actually finished, I was looking at the overall experiences of sexual assault and intimate partner survivors and their families. And so I'm going to use the term survivor today throughout my presentation because that is the term that the people I interviewed preferred. So in order to be respectful to the participants, that's what I'll be using. But you can also use the term victim synonymously, but today I'll be using survivor. And so when I was looking at this research, the overall experience that I was looking at was both the offline or person-to-person victimization and also the online victimization. I also looked at how they coped, whether it was the family or the survivors, as well as their experience with the criminal justice system, and also the aftermath. So after either the cyber or the in-person victimizations, what was their experiences like? And so I did semi-structured interviews. The shortest was 30 minutes, the longest was 4 hours. And these were conducted in person at a rape crisis center or domestic violence center. So I interviewed the survivors at the center. The family members could be interviewed by phone, and that was an IRB restriction. And so I recruited through posters, meaning that I had posters up at different centers throughout the state, as well as gatekeepers, meaning counselors, front desk workers, staff at the centers who would let survivors know and their family that this research was going on. And I also came to speak at some of the centers at their groups to tell them about the research opportunity. And so I did get permission from ICASA, the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault, as well as the domestic violence shelters where I came to do the research. And I used both rural, suburban, and urban centers in my research. So this is a look here at what my participants looked like. So I started this research in 2013, and I did the family interviews first. So from 2013 to 2017, I interviewed 23 mothers, 20 female spouses, 17 sisters, and 19 female friends. And so I did not set out to only include women. It just so happened that women are the people who are going with the survivors to the centers. There were a few men who I did interview. I think I had maybe 3 total, but the majority of the support system for survivors is women. And so I also included female friends because female friends often were the main support system for survivors. And I started interviewing survivors in 2015, and I actually just finished in 2018, and I had 32 women. Once again, not necessarily setting out to look for women, but that was who was utilizing the centers that I was working with. So over this period, I have 111 interviews, and so I'm going to be talking to you about those results from those interviews today. And so this is a table. I apologize, I know the font is a little bit small. I wanted you to be able to sort of see what the demographics look like for the family and also the survivors. And you can see the age breakdown, education breakdown, and then race. And if you notice, looking at the race, the majority is Caucasian, which, thinking about the area, I am in Illinois, I am in the Midwest, it makes sense in terms of breakdown. But I also was fortunate in the sense that I did have individuals who identified from other races, which I asked them to self-identify. I did not identify them. I asked them which race they most identified with. And then if you notice on geographic location, most were mid-sized city or rural, which, thinking about the Midwest, if you know anything about Illinois or the Midwest, that makes sense. And there was a lot of individuals who the rape crisis centers and domestic violence shelters I worked with were utilizing those centers. But I did have some large urban area as well. I also want to point to the survivor demographics. I did have some women who identified as bisexual and lesbian, but the majority of the women were from heterosexual relationships or heterosexual backgrounds. So to analyze these interviews, I used a grounded theory approach, meaning that when I went into this, I did not know what I was going to find, and I didn't necessarily have a hypothesis that I was looking for. I did have some questions that were made in conjunction with some people who worked at the Rape Crisis Center and domestic violence shelters just as a starting off point, but I wasn't necessarily knowing what I was going to find. So how I came up with the codes was through multiple readings, multiple listenings of the data to try to figure out what was the themes. And I also did use NVivo, for those of you who are familiar with the qualitative analysis software, to be able to pull out key quotes and to be able to put those into categories for my data. And so the findings that I'm going to talk to you about today, I'm going to talk to you about that connection between the in-person victimization and cybercrime. So 86% of family members and 91% of survivors experienced at least one, oftentimes more than one, cyber victimization in addition to their in-person victimization. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is what I categorized as cyber fraud, which is identity theft and social engineering, cybersexual abuse, revenge porn, and sextortion, and also cyberstalking. And so the one thing that came out of this research, once again, not knowing necessarily what I was looking for or what I was going to find, was this term called third victimization. And as much as I wish that I could take credit for this wonderful term, it was actually a participant that gave it to me. And so you can see here Ivy, who is a survivor, she said the online stuff was like a third victimization. And honestly, it was the worst. So first, I was raped and beaten, which was painful and awful, and what I thought was literally the worst thing that could ever have happened. Then I reported it, which actually may have been worse, as I was treated like I was to blame by the cops. I was humiliated at the hospital getting the kit done. It was real hard to get through all of it. But then the stuff that came made the rest seem easy. The constant texts and messages saying he would hurt me and my family and even threatening to kill Harry. The photos he posted of me, and the worst was he used my information to open credit cards online, even taking out a mortgage, and he ruined my credit. And so I think she really illustrates what this third victimization was, in the sense that first she was raped, then she went through her second victimization within the criminal justice system, and then she had this subsequent cyber victimization that happened after the fact. And so Ivy gave me this term, third victimization, which is what I'm going to be talking to you about today in terms of cyber victimization. And so the interviewees in general talked about how the cyber victimizations were much longer than the in-person victimizations, and that they were oftentimes worse. And so I pulled out some quotes here to illustrate for that for you. So people saying it was the worst, crippling, never-ending, terrifying. They were very much all consumed or encompassed by these cyber victimizations after they experienced in-person victimization. And so first I'm going to talk to you all about cyber fraud versus social engineering. So first I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you have heard of social engineering before. So if you hit the hand button and let me know if you have heard of social engineering. Okay, I've got some people raising their hands. And so when we think about social engineering, we often are thinking of this in terms of a stranger crime. Oftentimes this is facilitated through technology, oftentimes email, sometimes by phone, getting you to do something. And I gave you some examples on the slide. So updating a password, clicking on something if there was an incentive. Oftentimes this takes advantage of us and our emotional reactions, but one of the things that I found in my research that I was not necessarily looking for is that cyber fraud via social engineering can occur within intimate partner relationships. And so I gave you two examples here of quotes. And so Nancy, who was a survivor, talked about how the person she was in a relationship with had this elaborate scheme saying that she was pregnant and that he was going to surprise her with buying a house, and he lied to get her control of her money and her finances by pretending that this was happening. So reaching out to her family to be able to get this money to be able to control her ultimately. And Mia, who was a mother of a survivor, talked about how the abuser, who was her daughter's girlfriend, actually posed as her daughter via text and email to get control of her banking information and also to be able to get her social security card so that she would be able to take out credit cards in her name to be able to control her so she would not be able to leave her. So when we think about social engineering, we often don't think about this being committed against someone that you know or an intimate partner, but that was something that my research had revealed. So thinking about the next one, identity theft. So show of hands, who has heard of identity theft before? Yeah, so identity theft is something that we often think of, once again, being a stranger crime, right? We think of someone taking our identity, taking our bank account information, or opening up credit cards in our name. But this has happened within the confines of a current or former intimate partner violence relationship, where that person took that information and opened up credit cards, loans, or even mortgages online. And the goal was not financial, as we think about with stranger to stranger crime, but it was control. So ruining the survivor's credit so that they could not leave them or that they would be forced to come back to them. And so some examples I have here is Josie, who talked about how she tried to leave her abuser, and she had saved money, and she thought that she was finally going to get away. And you can see in her words here, the agency saw she had lots of unpaid credit cards. So he had taken them out in her name and never paid them. And she ended up going back to him. So she did try to leave, but because he had ruined her credit, she had to return. And Martha, who was the sister of a survivor, talked about how her sister tried to escape, but once again, the abuser had ruined her credit, and she was still trying to go through the bankruptcy process because he had controlled her credit and controlled her ultimately for years. And Martha, when I had interviewed her, and you can see the last line there, said, "I often worry that she will kill herself." And she actually did try to commit suicide after the interview. It's not reflected here, but just kind of as a side note, because her former spouse had ruined all of her credit and all of her chances of trying to get a job or get an apartment on her own. So the next one I'm going to be talking about is non-consensual pornography, also known as revenge porn, I think more commonly for a lot of us. So who here in the group has heard of revenge porn before? Yeah, a lot of us, right? This has been kind of on the national radar recently. And so when we're talking about revenge porn or non-consensual pornography, we're talking about the distribution of sexually graphic or explicit images, usually by somebody you were involved in a relationship with or a sexual relationship with. And it can be through email, on public websites, social media, text messaging, and there are also sites dedicated directly to revenge porn. And so that's what a lot of the images the people I interviewed are going to talk to you about. But I also want to be sure that I mention that it could be real or constructed images, meaning that it could be photoshopped. It doesn't have to be an actual image of that person. And so Alice, I think about Alice all the time as someone I interviewed because she had a really hard time. And I'm just going to read you her quote because I think that her words are really powerful. "He had my naked pictures on a few of those sites. He put my name, my home address, cell number, the school I worked at, and a link to my Facebook and Twitter. The description that he put on there, that I was a dirty, I'm not going to say the word, you all can fill in those asterisks, that was up for anything, so contact her. I had men calling me and leaving messages, sending me disgusting messages online saying they saw me. Then the school found out that I was and I was placed on leave and dismissed. Even after I would get the pics off the site, they would be back up again, and the whole process continued over and over. I couldn't be online, and I had to change my number. I even had men showing up, touching themselves in my front yard." So Alice lost her job, had men masturbating in her front lawn, and one of the things that is not mentioned in this quote that I will tell you is she fell in semen that was on her front porch from men who would masturbate on her front porch because they had seen her online on this revenge porn site, because that was what her ex-boyfriend was repeatedly doing. He was putting it on multiple sites, all the time. And so she really suffered at the hands of her former boyfriend because of revenge porn. Mary, who was a mother, and Trinity, who was a friend, they talked about how hard this was to watch people going through it. And so Mary is talking about how her daughter was a police officer, and all of the men at the station saw those pictures of her, and she ended up having to leave the station because she was merciless teased about it. And those pictures were put up in her locker, and people had shared them with other stations. And so she ended up taking a job at a police station out of state. Also, Trinity, the friend, was talking about how the sex tape that she had made with her ex-boyfriend had been put online and distributed, and then she actually was sexually assaulted by her manager, who had seen the sex tape online. So this led to real-world consequences of sexual assault. And so cybersexual exploitation, more commonly known as sextortion. So show of hands, who has heard of this before? So this oftentimes is good old-fashioned extortion, but with a new twist of technology, meaning that through some sort of technological means, that person is pressured to engage in sexual actions, or there's also that threat that they will distribute images through technology. And so a lot of individuals who I had interviewed experienced that. You can see two quotes here. And Ivy, who was the one who gave me the third victimization from the beginning of this presentation, said that her former spouse threatened to sell or send pictures that he took of her daughter to child pornography sites if she did not do what he wanted. And so she said she did not do that. She did not give in to his threats, but she really thought about it because she was very terrified that he would send those pictures of her 2-year-old daughter to child pornography sites. And Kathleen said that, he would hurt her unless she paid him the money that he wanted. And so these were real-world consequences, thinking about this, act of distributing. So this was really tied to revenge pornography and, once again, technology. And so cyberstalking was the most common. So show of hands, who's heard of cyberstalking? I see a lot of hands. This is the most common, I think, that we've all heard about over the years, and this was the most common. Every single survivor, so all 32, experienced cyberstalking. And a lot of the family members also experienced cyberstalking. And so this can include harassment or scaring the victims, also, repeated messaging, as well as monitoring victims with audio-visual devices or computer software. And so quite a few, like I said, experienced this. So Billy talks about how he monitored everything she did online through spyware. Donna, another survivor, talked about how he knew where she was going and what she was doing, and that he would also be asking her about the things that she did online. And then Jody, who was a mother, she worried about her daughter, and she was afraid that every time she would leave that she would not come home because her daughter's boyfriend was monitoring her and her actions, and also had a GPS and tracking device installed multiple times. So she was very worried about her daughter's safety. I also have some other quotes here. You can see Dana talking about how she was being threatened and she felt that she was living in terror. And also Gina, her spouse would log into Facebook and post things as her, oftentimes racist or horrible things, trying to get her fired from her job. And then Kayla, mother, talked about how her daughter's boyfriend ended up physically hurting her after she got a new phone when she discovered that he had installed spyware onto her phone. He actually broke her wrist and he had given her a black eye and pulled out a huge chunk of her hair after he found out she had gotten a new phone and was privy to the fact that he was spying on her. And so to summarize these findings, I found, looking at this, that there is this relationship between the cyber and what is occurring online. And within the fact of an intimate partner relationship. So we often think of online crimes as stranger, but I found that a lot of the online crimes were related to intimate partner violence. And so I'm going to talk to you about some things that will be, I think I've seen a few questions coming up. This is related to how these individuals experience this with the criminal justice system. So the overall themes are from my research, because I did ask them about the criminal justice system. And so they had reported in general that they felt that law enforcement was not equipped to handle cyber victimization and did not understand the interpersonal nature of it. And they also had felt that rape crisis and domestic violence shelters were really great with the in-person victimizations, but there was not a lot done to address the cyber. And also that a lot of service providers were not necessarily aware of how the cyber victimizations occurred, and then also survivors themselves oftentimes were unaware that what was happening to them was actually criminal. And so I have some quotes to illustrate this. So Jennifer talking about she didn't know where to turn, and Carol, who is a friend, said, kept going back to the police and went back to the police when the online occurred. And the best thing that she got, she talks here, you can see she says, sending dick pics, the individual got arrested for harassment. And so it had been 2 years and she's still getting these random dick pics sent to her. And so what she ended up doing, which I've heard from 7 other survivors, is that they hired a private service. And so they were not able to get the results they needed going to the police. So they hired a private service. It's out of Kansas City. They paid them to monitor their images. So they monitor their images and whether or not it's appearing on any revenge porn sites. And then they also help them with any of the sextortion type issues that they have. But they pay a lot of money for this, as all of the 7 had told me in my interviews. Also, Anna might have been one of my favorites, as she talked about how she went to report the cyber victimization to the police. And so Anna lived in a really very small town that had 2 officers, and they didn't understand what she was telling them about. And so his suggestion was to call the FBI. And so she felt very frustrated because she didn't know how to just call the FBI. And so she ended up not having any legal remedy or any help from law enforcement for her cyber victimization. And Layla also experienced something else similar, saying that she didn't really get a lot of help, and that the center that she went to was great, but they didn't necessarily help her with the online. And so some more quotes here. Amanda talked about the great help she got at the center, but that she didn't really get a lot of help coping with the online. And Betty, who was a mother, said that, the police were able to help, but she was over 18, and so that was one of the things that they said was a real detriment, that it wasn't child pornography, that any of the revenge porn that was happening was not something that they could really assist with. So overall, survivors felt when they went to try to get remedies, they were not able to get what they needed, which is why a lot of them turned to private companies. And so thinking about this, so what does this mean, right? I told you all about this research, all these horrible things that happen to women. So my suggestions, and I'm going to tell you how I tried to assist in this, is first, specialized training to promote greater awareness regarding cyber victimizations for people who work with intimate partner violence and sexual assault survivors and their families. And also some support for individuals who are going through these cyber victimizations, and then education kind of in the community at large. So one of the things that I did after doing this research was I took my classes. So here at ISU, I teach victimology and I also teach the sex offender course. And so I looked at what was in my research and I thought about how I could try to make this better for survivors. So I partnered with the YWCA Stepping Stones Rape Crisis Center to try to improve some of the deficits that I saw in my research. And so what I did was I had my students create informational brochures about cyber victimization for our local police as well as the local Rape Crisis Center Stepping Stones. So these brochures and informational packets can be something that the police themselves can utilize, but they can also pass it out to the community. And so you can see the topics listed there. I asked police and I also asked the Rape Crisis Center what they thought would be most beneficial, and that is what they had said. And I just saw a question, would you be able to share those with webinar participants? Yes, I will be able to. I can give those to Susan and she can distribute those to the webinar participants. I also had my students, once again partnering with the Rape Crisis Center and also the local police, to create comic books and children's books that they used in the K through 12 education program. So Stepping Stones does education programs, and so does the local police. And so we made books that talked about cyber victimization. And so you can kind of see in the middle there the little clip, Tales of Fenrir and Annabee. This was really creative on my students' part, and that this is Beauty and the Beast. And if you've had kids or you're familiar with Beauty and the Beast, he has a mirror that he can see everything. They use that to talk about spyware being installed on phones and how someone who does that on the phone can see everything just like the Beast could. And so that was really effective for the students who were getting these books, as well as you can sort of see in the picture there, there were comic books that were made that used Marvel Lego, so those were characters that were already identifiable, and they talked about cyber victimizations. And so this was beneficial in the sense that kids can learn about cyber victimizations and what it means earlier on, also in relation to domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And so I also did something that I wanted to share with you in raising awareness and education about cyber victimization, sexual assault, and intimate partner violence, which is we did an art exhibit that was publicly displayed in our local library, and this was partnered with Stepping Stones for their Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so each student in my class had to take a children's toy and manipulate it in some way to make a statement about intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and a lot of them also chose cyber victimization and this relationship between the online and the offline victimization. And I gave you an example here, and this is a frog, and there are 84 pins. Each one represents a death that occurred because of domestic violence in Illinois during that year that they selected. And the black pins, which you can actually see there's quite a bit of black pins, is a child that died during that year. And someone had asked me, where can we get those? Can we purchase them? I'm happy to share any of my assignments that I have students do, because the more people that do that, in my opinion, the better. So I will provide Susan with some resources after the webinar. I've also had students, once again in my classes, create materials for use in support groups, because one of the things that my family members that I interviewed noted was that there were not support groups for family members. So, you know, they themselves felt sort of isolated, that they had no one to talk to. So students created support group materials. And one of the wonderful things that Stepping Stones has done is that they created specific support groups for family, for just students. So we have a survivor group on the ISU campus run by Stepping Stones, a male support group, and also LGBTQ, because one of the things that LGBTQ participants told me was they didn't feel comfortable being in a group with heterosexual women who had been victimized. So Stepping Stones responded to these results from my research. And I'm actually going to turn this over to Kelsey, who is going to talk to you about our partnership within Stepping Stones and how my research has actually impacted their day-to-day.
Okay, so as Shelly said, we have worked with her and her students multiple times. They have made books, pamphlets, flyers, anything explaining sexual assault, victimization, stalking, and cyber victimization.
Kelsey?
Yes.
This is Susan. Can you speak up a bit more? A few of our participants are having trouble hearing you.
Oh, sorry about that. So we have worked together with cyber victimization, sexual assault, and basically these students are taking information that they're learning in Shelly's classes and creating something with it, something that we can use throughout support groups. So the information is useful for secondary survivors, which is something that Shelly and I worked on when I was an undergrad, because secondary survivors oftentimes don't get as much resources and services as sexual assault survivors themselves. So us at Stepping Stones, we do see secondary survivors, and that can be friends, family members, parents, significant others. So through these interviews that Shelly has been describing throughout this presentation, allowed us to get a better understanding of what services are needed in the community, because we want to make sure that we're giving everybody as much help as they can get. So the research pinpointed exactly what we needed to do, and the interview participants were able to express, different things that they go through. So coping mechanisms when trying to process their loved one's assault. So with this, like counselors and advocates, they were able to, take this information and ultimately assist in their counseling and advocacy techniques. Okay, so all of the research projects that the students did allowed for them to get a better understanding of IPV and cyber abuse. Oh, I just saw a question. So how many participants did you have in those support groups? So it really varies. I think the highest that we've had may have been like 10 participants, and we have gone down to as small as 2. Sometimes that one's not as active, because if one person doesn't come, we might just switch to individual counseling. It really just depends. So the counselors and advocates, like I said, use this information, and it really correlates with intimate partner violence and sexual assault, so we're able to use that and kind of dive into different issues that they may have had, like cyber stalking, cyber harassment, identity theft, revenge porn, and sextortion. So another thing that we've done a couple of times is event partnerships. So we have worked at Stepping Stones with ISU and with Shelly and her students through different events, especially in the month of April, because that is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So we have done Take Back the Night, which is an event that allows it's time where victims of sexual assault can rally together with people who are in their support system. So staff of Stepping Stones, people in the community that are supporters of them, friends, family. So they gather around. Survivors are allowed to present or speak what they want to say, tell the crowd their story, and then we do a march, kind of just showing support for them. We also do Walk a Mile in Her Shoes, which is an event that men in the community do. They wear high-heeled shoes and they walk for a mile, and it's just kind of raising awareness, for men to kind of take part in stopping it. There's other things like Clothesline Project. We've done fundraising, and Shelly and her students are so great about giving us donations for not just Stepping Stones, but other organizations in the community too. And I'm going to pass it back to Shelly.
All right, everybody. So we have some time left. I wanted to make sure that I had time for questions, and I tried to look as people were going through what sort of questions they had if I answered them but we are happy to take questions.
Hi, I'll start, Shelly.
Okay.
What prompted you look into this issue in the first place?
So it's really interesting. So prior to my husband, who I'm married to now, I dated a man who had been sexually assaulted. And me being in that relationship with him, I was the first person he told. He, told his family. We tried to find resources. He also experienced some cyber victimization, and I didn't have there wasn't anywhere to turn, and my experience having been kind of that secondary survivor and then watching him go through that made me kind of dive into it. So after I finished my PhD and got my real job, I decided, based on my own personal experiences with this was something that I thought was missing for our understanding within sexual assault.
Great. I don't mean to hog all the time here. Participants, please enter any questions you have for Shelly or Kelsey in the chat box. But I'll ask one more. Shelly, what surprised you about this research? Did you find exactly what you expected to find, or was there anything that really took you aback?
It's interesting. I would say everything surprised me because the thing that I wasn't necessarily looking for was some of the cyber stuff. I didn't necessarily think about identity theft being committed, or I didn't think about revenge porn being as common as it was. And I also didn't necessarily think about the suffering that the family would have. Not that, like I said, from my own personal experiences, I didn't see it, but they really suffered right alongside the survivor. So I felt like everything was just so interesting to me. It was really hard for me actually to stop the research, but I was like, well, 6 years. Now I'm going to move on to targeting a more targeted sample of LGBTQ, because I felt that that was something that wasn't necessarily explored in my research.
That's great. Now we're going to continue with the questions, but I will ask Jason to open up the poll. We've gotten a couple of questions through the chat.
Yes.
And I'll read them out loud. Let me reopen the chat there. So one question, one of our participants is curious about what advice you have for advocates working especially with college students experiencing cyber victimization and having similar experiences with law enforcement that you described.
So my experience and my suggestion is first to be supportive. I think that was something that some people who I interviewed felt that, they didn't necessarily feel supported, or that people didn't understand the cyber victimizations. And so I think it's important for advocates, if they don't necessarily understand the cyber victimizations, to try to learn what the experience is. And that was the main thing. So some of the survivors would say, I went to the center, they were great about the in-person, but then they didn't understand or know what revenge porn was. And so I think that education is important, and then supporting them or telling them, I'm not necessarily familiar with this, but I believe you. I'm validating you and your experience. I will help you in any way that I can.
Great, thank you. Shirley, we are losing your voice a little bit.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead with the next question. Another one of our participants would like to know about outreach done in primary schools on this topic. She herself had a family member who was victimized at a young age, but the local school district didn't think there was any need for outreach in the local grade levels.
Yes, I am a huge advocate about outreach in the younger primary schools. And so one of the wonderful things about Stepping Stones is that they actually go into primary schools. and talk about victimization, not just sexual victimization, but the realities of sexual victimization. Instead of just teaching stranger danger, we need to talk about the fact that you could be victimized as a child by somebody known to you. So I'm a huge advocate of teaching young children the realities of sexual assault. And to kind of put that in perspective, I have a 4-year-old, and I am already teaching her about consent. I think it's important for us to start that at a young age, specifically within the schools.
That's great, thank you. We're still having a little bit of trouble with your voice. Here's another question. How did many of the survivors find out that their photos were on these revenge porn sites? For example, would the abusers themselves send the survivors links in order to harass them?
So it was mixed. Sometimes it was that the offender was doing that. Other times it was people who they knew told them that their pictures were on there. So it just depends. So a lot of the survivors, the offender would send them the link or a screenshot of it, or for 3 women, it was students. So their students were looking online at these revenge porn sites and then telling them, hey, you know, Mrs. Smith, we saw your picture on this site.
Thank you. Another question is about follow-up. After the students or people provided law enforcement with the information on cyber victimization, so after your active students got involved creating these materials, did you follow up with law enforcement or victims or the advocates to see if practices changed or any impacts were seen?
Yeah, we have. So every semester we work with the local law enforcement and then also stepping stones. And I think, and I mean, I don't have actual data of this, that could be a great project, but I think just anecdotally that people are understanding what these crimes are and then also how to better respond to survivors. And I've noticed doing some of the interviews as I started to do more outreach in the community that people are having better experiences at the Rape Crisis Center and at the police because their cyber victimizations are being believed and validated in a way that they weren't in 2013 when I first started doing the research.
Very good. That's very encouraging. We had another question, and I'm sure this has occurred to a couple of our participants. Do you have any suggestions for balancing teaching cyber victimization to students without giving potential abusers new tools to use to instill fear and chaos?
Yes, it's so funny that someone should ask that because sometimes when I'm doing these classes, or training in different organizations, I have to say this is not a how-to class. And so I was hearing some loud noise. Okay. So I usually will start by saying this is not a how-to class. I'm going to tell you how these things work or how these things exist for educational purposes. I actually worry about that a lot, that me telling you all of this information about these cyber victimizations that people will then go and do it. I'm hoping that it will not be the case, especially in my classes. So when I teach undergrad classes, I will show them how you could do spyware on a phone or how you would find spyware on your phone, how you would, how you can see revenge porn sites. And it is a concern of mine. I'm not sure how you prevent that from happening other than by me talking about what happens to the people who are victimized. I'm always trying to promote empathy, so I'm hoping that will be enough to stop people from using what I'm teaching them for evil, with lack of a better way of saying it.
Thank you. We had another question or an observation that it seems like law enforcement might be able to use the cyber victimization incidents to prosecute not only the cyber crime, but also the original incident. Have you ever observed that?
So here in Illinois, which is where I did the research, people have been prosecuted. We have a pretty comprehensive cyberstalking statute here, and so there have been some people that have been prosecuted at the felony level and received prison time, but that has, in my experience, been a rarity. Most people are not getting prosecuted to the full extent of the law. At least from the people I've interviewed, their offenders were not.
Great. We've had a couple of questions about particular tools, and I don't know whether you or Kelsey have had experience with any of these, but have you had any luck with reverse photo lookup through web browsers, or do you have suggestions for how people can see whether their phones have been compromised with spyware?
So the main thing that I have had in interviewing people that I have had individuals, or they've had success with, is it was Tor, T-O-R, had anti-spyware, or it's called the Tor browser bundle, that they were able to install on their devices to find out if there was spyware. And in terms of the images, I have heard of the one that was just mentioned, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. I'll have to look it up and give it to you, Susan. There is a software that you can use to see if your image has been shared on the internet that one of my survivors had told me about.
Great. So I made a note to people that we will be sharing some practical resources when we circulate the recording of this webinar.
Yes.
All right. It looks like that's all the questions we have received so far. Shelly, do you or Kelsey have any closing thoughts you'd like to share?
I'll speak for both of us, I guess. I was just looking at Kelsey. The main thing that we want, I guess, from doing this is for people to, number one, believe survivors, and then number two, support them, both survivors and their families. All right.
I want to thank you both for, first of all, doing this research. As you well know, this is an understudied area, and any information we can get about what is actually happening in the lives of survivors and their supporters is important. I think this gives a lot of us ideas about where we can move from here to improve our services and then take on new areas of research. Yeah. So thank you both for all your time.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone out there in Radio Land. You'll be receiving the link to the recording and the resources we promised, and we thank you for your participation today. Goodbye, everyone.